My name is Indra. I'm the Director of Environmental Health and Water Policy for the Hoosier Environmental Council. I'm going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint that I've got to wrap us up here. The Hoosier Environmental Council is a not-for-profit organization that's been working on healthy environment and sustainable economy for Indiana since 1983. And this afternoon, we have heard inspiring talks about the science and beauty and value of wetlands. We've heard about their critical role in the water resources of our state, the vital role they play for many species that rely on them. And now we've heard, sort of step by step, how the current wetlands law works to help protect wetlands in our state. And it protects them chiefly by making sure that if a development project has to impact a wetland, that wetland gets replaced through what's called mitigation. So what's before us now as a state is a policy decision. Are we going to continue to protect the state wetlands? And if so, how are we going to protect them? Just repeating some of what we heard earlier, since European settlement, Indiana has lost 85% of its original wetlands. And of the wetlands that remain, 10 to 20% are federally protected and 80 to 90% are state protected. And those numbers come from testimony that was provided by our state environmental agency. So as a state, it's up to us to decide what we're going to do with that 80 to 90%. Back in 2003, Indiana's legislature recognized the value of the remaining wetlands and wrote Indiana's Wetlands Law. And of course, as Brian mentioned, it got implemented in 2005. Just a month ago, this bill was introduced in the Indiana legislature that would repeal Indiana's Wetlands Law. The bill is known as Senate Bill 389 or SB 389. The Indiana Senate has already passed SB 389, so they have voted for a full repeal of state wetland protection, and the bill now goes to the House for consideration. A number of reasons have been put forward in favor of a repeal of Indiana's Wetlands Law, and I'd like to address some of the reasons that we've heard in discussion. One reason that's been given is that Indiana should not be more stringent than the federal government. This is essentially arguing that we should not protect any wetlands that are not federally protected. So some are federally protected, we should stop there, and the state shouldn't protect any additional wetlands. The counterpoint to that argument is that federal regulation was intentionally built to delegate responsibility to the state. If we are protecting the non-federal wetlands, we're simply taking responsibility for our own state resources. Another reason that has been given in favor of repeal is that federal wetlands are the important ones, so loss of the state regulated wetlands will not affect water quality or flooding. And of course, today we've heard in some depth those points clearly debunked. All wetlands have value and have important functions in the ecosystem and in our hydrologic system, our water system. Another reason that we've heard in favor of repealing the state wetland law is that wetland regulation hurts farmers. So this has come up a number of times, both in the Senate committee and in the Senate floor debate. However, there are specific exemptions in the wetland law, and I've actually put verbatim one of the exemptions from the law IC, which is Indiana Code 131822. There's a list of exceptions, and one of those exceptions is for normal farming, silviculture, and ranching activities, such as plowing, seeding, cultivating, minor drainage, and harvesting. And then the law goes on to a more detailed exemption for drainage. There's also an exemption for incidental wet spots that occur in farm fields. So it's hard to see how the law might actually be hurting farmers. But another way of looking at that is to what extent have farmers wound up in the wetland permitting process? Well, item provided data from the last 4 years, and over that time, no farm was regulated under the state law such that it had to build, replacement wetlands or do wetland mitigation. And over those same 4 years, farms were only responsible for a total of 4.39 acres of wetland mitigation for federal wetlands. So even if all wetlands in the state were regulated under our state law, it would be on average only an acre per year of wetland mitigation from our agricultural property owners. Another reason that we've heard in favor of repeal is that wetland regulation increases the cost of housing. And the counterpoint to that is that in the last 4 years, on average, there have been seven housing development projects per year that did mitigation for state wetlands. And there were only 6 housing development projects per year that had to do mitigation for federal wetlands. So on average, there are about 13 housing development projects per year that have either state wetland or federal wetland impacts. And it's hard to imagine that only 13 projects per year would actually have an impact on the state's entire cost of housing. And in fact, this headline came up just a month ago in Inside Indiana Business that home construction permits have hit a 12-year high in central Indiana. It's kind of further debunking the notion that construction is being hurt by wetland regulation. And the final reason that I wanted to touch on that has been given in favor of repeal is that Indiana's Wetlands Law interferes with personal property rights. And I think that this, it may be the crux of the problem that's driving Senate Bill 389. This bill raises a very basic policy question. If I own property and there's a wetland on my property, why can't I do what I want with it? And I felt like it was important for us to address that point head on. The counterpoint to that is that wetlands are part of the water system, which is a shared resource. Like air is a shared resource. Water ignores property lines the same way air does. What one person does to one part of the water system on one property affects everyone else. And I'd like to show just one kind of simple example. So here's one example of how wetlands are a shared resource. According to the EPA, 1 acre of wetland can hold 1 to 1.5 million gallons of water. So if I have 1 acre of wetland on my property, and we'll say that, these 2 wetlands here are mine and they add up to 1 acre, then that 1 acre of wetland, during the wet part of the year could be holding 1 to 1.5 million gallons of water. If I decide to fill those wetlands, then during the next big storm, the 1 million gallons of water from that wetland will have to go somewhere else and it might flood my neighbor. Water ignores property lines and it's a common resource. So from a policy standpoint, it's a resource that we need to steward as a society. It's not something that we can do as individuals. The current debate, is over the fate of the state wetlands law. And it will lead to one of several possible outcomes. One outcome is that if Senate Bill 389 passes, then our legislature will have decided that as a society, we do not need to protect the state wetlands. So if it passes, then 80 to 90% of the wetlands in Indiana that are the state wetlands could be destroyed at will. This will save money for individual developers, but as wetlands are destroyed, there will be a high cost to society in increased flooding, reduced groundwater recharge, reduced water quality, and loss of plant and animal species, as we heard, so beautifully covered from 3 to 4 o'clock this afternoon. So that would be the path if Senate Bill 389 passes, but there are other options. One, of course, is over the next 6 to 8 weeks as the legislative session goes through its second half, 389 could pass the House and that would mean a repeal of the Indiana Wetlands Law. 389 might be stopped. Maybe the members of the House don't decide they don't care for the bill, they vote against it, or even if they pass it, I suppose it could get vetoed by the governor. So if that happens, if the bill is just plain stopped, we would keep our existing wetlands law. And finally, it's possible that Senate Bill 389 will get revised as it goes through the House. There has been frustration with complexity of the existing wetlands law, so it may be worth considering changes. And as Brian talked about, I mean, there have been changes since the law was first written in 2003. Like there have been changes in how many wetlands are federal versus state protected. The legislature added the in lieu fee process in 2015 to make wetland mitigation easier. And IDEM has been improving the permit process, and it sounds like more improvements are in the pike. And then as we heard from one of our research colleagues earlier, we're seeing an increase in the number of heavy storms, an increase overall in precipitation, and more of that precipitation is coming in extreme storms. So a number of ideas have come up for potentially revising the law and revising Senate Bill 389. It may be that Indiana's wetlands law could benefit from additional changes. There may be ways to reduce the complexity of the permit process. There may be ways to align it with the federal permit process such that that reduces complexity and simplifies things for those who have to apply for a wetland permit. And perhaps it'll be possible to create more incentives for property owners who preserve wetlands, and we can achieve more wetland preservation in that way. So if we're going to revise our wetlands law, it's worth doing so in a thoughtful and considered manner. We should examine what the state has learned over the last 18 years under the current law, and we should take time to look at how wetlands are protected in other states. According to the Environmental Law Institute, 23 states have permitting programs for some or all of their freshwater wetlands, although, yeah, as we've heard, the regulation in different states does vary. So one way we could look at revising our current wetlands law would be through one of the legislature's summer study committees that meet between legislative sessions, and another would be by creating a task force. It's honestly quite difficult to have an in-depth discussion during the legislative session. Our legislature is in session for only a few months of each year, and during that time they consider hundreds of bills on so many different topics. This screen grab from the legislative website has only a small fraction of the bills that were introduced this year. This particular legislative session is even more challenging, and that's because this is a budget writing year. And it's also because the legislature is addressing COVID issues. On top of that, COVID precautions are reducing the time available for committee meetings. And committee meetings are usually when the most in-depth discussions can happen during the legislative session. So a careful consideration of revisions to the wetlands law with everyone at the table could happen more effectively outside of the legislative session. Now, the Indiana Senate actually considered whether to send this issue of revising our wetlands law to a summer study committee. The Senate rejected that approach, but it could be revisited in the House. So at the moment, Senate Bill 389 is a full repeal of the state wetlands law, and it would leave 80 to 90% of our remaining wetlands in jeopardy. It could be amended as it goes through the House over the course of the next 6 or 7 weeks. There are many groups looking at options for changing the bill so that it revises the law instead of completely repealing it. And there are many groups that actually support taking this discussion outside of the legislative session where it can be more thorough. If you're interested in following this bill or any of the other environmental bills during the legislative session, the Hoosier Environmental Council keeps a Bill Watch 2021 website. where you can see the updates. We also send out an email newsletter on a regular basis with updates. And of course, there are also updates on our social media. And I wanted to put in just a quick advocacy note. You know, I do work for an advocacy organization, and encourage everyone to contact your legislator and tell them where you think Indiana should be when it comes to protecting our state wetlands. If you go to your internet browser and you search for Indiana Find My Legislator, you should get this website where you enter your street address, and then it will show you who your legislators are and how to contact them. Our legislators really need to hear from the voters and hear from their constituents about what they want for our state wetlands. And finally, this is Wetlands Action Week from February 21st through the 27th. Please, if you have photos, post your wetland photos with the hashtag Wetlands Action Week and tag your legislator. And with that, we can go to more questions.